The jet engine roared so loud it drowned out the wedding music. And that was the moment everyone realized something was terribly wrong. The sound cut across the manicured gardens like a blade through silk, sharp and out of place among the soft violin melodies drifting through the summer air. Guests turned their heads almost in unison, champagne glasses pausing halfway to lips, conversations freezing mid-sentence as a sleek white private jet descended beyond the rolling hills just past the estate. No one had expected this. Not at a wedding designed down to the last petal and place card, especially not Garrett Sullivan, who stood beneath a canopy of white roses in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, smiling for cameras, shaking hands, playing the role of a man who had rebuilt his life flawlessly, a man who had moved on, completely untouched by the past. At least that's what he wanted everyone to believe, because today wasn't just his wedding day. It was his statement, his proof that he had chosen the right path, that leaving his ex-wife had been necessary, even justified. The guests believed it too. They saw the elegant bride. Beside him, Tessa Brightwell, radiant in a designer gown, her hand resting confidently on his arm. They saw success, beauty, a fresh beginning, and none of them questioned the quiet absence that lingered beneath it all. None of them noticed the invisible space where someone else should have been, until the sky itself seemed to interrupt, the low thunder of the jet growing louder, heavier, impossible to ignore. A few guests exchanged glances, murmurs spreading like ripples through the crowd. Someone whispered that it must be a celebrity arrival. Another guessed it was a dramatic gesture from one of Garrett's wealthy business partners. But Garrett knew better, or at least part of him did, because there was only one person who had ever been unpredictable enough to turn a moment like this into something else entirely. And her name had been carefully erased from today's narrative, Rebecca Hartwell, the woman he had once called his wife, the woman whose absence was supposed to be permanent, controlled, clean. He had even sent her an invitation, not out of kindness, but out of calculation, a polished envelope, expensive, deliberate, with a short handwritten note that said, "No hard feelings." Words that sounded harmless but carried a quiet finality, an expectation that she would remain exactly where he left her, small, silent, forgotten. He had imagined her receiving it in some cramped apartment, maybe hesitating, maybe even considering coming, but ultimately deciding not to, because that's what people like her did. They stayed out of the spotlight. They accepted their role in someone else's story. They faded, and for a while, it had worked. For 18 months, Rebecca had disappeared completely. No calls, no public appearances, nothing that hinted at resistance or change. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes people comfortable. The kind that allows a man like Garrett to rewrite history without interruption. But silence, as it turned out, was never the same thing as surrender. And now, as the jet's engine slowed into a low, controlled hum beyond the horizon, that silence began to crack, because something was coming, something that didn't fit into the script he had written. Garrett's smile faltered just slightly, almost imperceptible, but enough for those closest to him to notice, enough for Tessa to tighten her grip on his arm, her perfectly composed expression flickering for a fraction of a second. The officiant paused, unsure whether to continue or wait, and the music softened, uncertain, like the entire event was holding its breath, because deep down, everyone could feel it. This wasn't just an interruption, it was an arrival, and whatever stepped out of that jet was about to change everything. The jet's engine finally settled into a low, controlled whisper, but the tension it left behind only grew louder, stretching across the garden like an invisible wire pulled too tight. And Garrett could feel it, not in the air, but in his chest, a subtle pressure that did not belong on a day that was supposed to be perfect. His gaze drifted beyond the ceremony, past the rows of seated guests and the carefully arranged white orchids, toward the distant landing strip that had never been part of the plan, because everything about today had been planned, every detail negotiated, approved, rehearsed, from the seating chart to the exact timing of the vows. There was no room for surprises, not anymore, not after everything he had built to get here. The narrative was simple, clean, controlled. He had moved on, he had upgraded, he had left behind a past that no longer served him. And the people around him believed it because he had made sure they would. They saw success in the polished surface of his life, not the cracks underneath. But now those cracks were beginning to show, thin at first, almost invisible, like hairline fractures in glass, yet impossible to ignore once you noticed them. Tessa leaned closer, her voice low but edged with something sharper than concern, asking if everything was all right, and Garrett nodded automatically, the kind of reflex that had carried him through boardrooms and negotiations. But this was different. This was not something he could manage with a calm tone and a practiced smile, because this felt personal, uncomfortably personal, like a memory forcing its way back into the present, and memories had a way of undoing even the most carefully constructed illusions. 18 months earlier, Rebecca Hartwell had stood in a small apartment kitchen, holding that same cream-colored envelope in her hands, the paper thick, expensive, chosen with intention. Garrett had always cared about appearances, even when ending things, especially when ending things. The message inside had been short, almost casual, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened before it, the affair that had started quietly and then refused to stay hidden, the long nights that turned into excuses, the gradual shift from partnership to distance, and finally, the legal documents that reduced years of marriage into numbers and signatures. Rebecca had not argued the way people expected her to. She had not created a scene or demanded explanations that would never be satisfying. She had simply listened, quietly, as if she already understood that the outcome had been decided long before the conversation began. Garrett had interpreted that silence as weakness, as acceptance, as confirmation that she would fade into the background exactly as he needed her to. And when the court finalized everything, when the assets were divided and the accounts were closed, he believed the story was finished, that the chapter had ended cleanly. But endings, like silence, can be misleading, because what looks like an end is sometimes only a pause, a moment where something shifts out of sight and begins to grow in a different direction, unseen, underestimated, and now, as the faint outline of the jet shimmered in the distance under the afternoon sun, Garrett felt that realization settle in with quiet certainty. Whatever had been silent for the past 18 months was no longer staying hidden, and whatever was about to step into this carefully staged moment was not coming to watch. It was coming to change the outcome entirely. The first car from the wedding procession had just arrived at the outer gate when a second sound followed the jet, softer but far more deliberate. The slow roll of black tires on gravel, measured, unhurried, impossible to ignore once it began, and this time the guests did not pretend it was part of the program. Heads turned fully now. Conversations dissolved completely. Phones subtly lifted as curiosity replaced celebration, because something about the timing felt precise, intentional, like a scene unfolding rather than an accident interrupting it. Garrett's throat tightened as he watched the distant figures near the landing strip begin to move, small at first, silhouettes against the bright afternoon sky, but growing clearer with each step. And with that clarity came recognition, not immediate, not obvious, but creeping in the way a familiar melody returns before you can name the song. 18 months earlier, Rebecca had stood in front of a mirror that barely held together on the wall of her apartment, the glass slightly warped, reflecting a version of herself she did not quite recognize anymore. The exhaustion had been real, the quiet had been real, the struggle had been real, but none of those things had been permanent, because while Garrett had been rewriting his story in public, Rebecca had been rebuilding hers in private. Piece by piece, decision by decision, starting with something simple, answering an email she had almost ignored, a message from a man named Julian Cross, someone she had met by accident months before, someone who had seen her not as a reminder of what she lost, but as proof of what she still carried. And that difference mattered more than she expected. Julian had never rushed her, never demanded explanations. He had simply stayed present, steady in a way that felt unfamiliar at first, until it became something she could rely on. And slowly, quietly, things began to change. Opportunities appeared where there had been none. Doors opened that she did not even know existed. And behind those doors were truths, documents, records that told a different version of her past, one that Garrett had never intended for anyone to see, accounts that had not been disclosed, transactions that had been carefully hidden, patterns that only made sense once you stepped back far enough to see them clearly. Rebecca had not reacted immediately. She had not confronted him. She had not reached out or made threats. Instead, she had waited, learning, preparing, understanding that timing would matter more than emotion, because truth, when revealed too early, can be dismissed, but truth, when revealed at the right moment, can reshape everything. And now that moment was approaching. Back at the wedding, the figures from the landing strip had reached the edge of the estate, close enough for details to emerge. The sharp lines of tailored clothing, the controlled confidence in their posture, and at the center of them, a woman whose presence did not ask for attention yet commanded it anyway, her pace steady, her expression calm, and though no one had said her name yet, a quiet recognition began to ripple through the crowd, subtle at first, then undeniable. Garrett felt it before he fully saw her, the shift in the air, the way anticipation replaced certainty, and when his eyes finally locked onto her face, the past he thought he had buried did not return as a memory. It returned as something far more dangerous, something real, something standing just a few steps away from the life he had tried so carefully to control. Rebecca did not stop when she reached the first row of chairs. She did not hesitate or glance around for approval. She simply kept walking as if she had always belonged exactly where she was. And that was what unsettled everyone the most. Not her presence alone, but the certainty behind it. The quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself. The kind that could not be borrowed or faked. Garrett felt his pulse rise, sharp and uneven, as every version of the past he had constructed began to collapse under the weight of what he was seeing. Because this was not the woman he remembered leaving behind. This was not the version of Rebecca that existed in his carefully edited story. The one who struggled quietly, who accepted outcomes without resistance, who stayed out of sight. This woman moved differently, carried herself differently, her posture straight, her gaze steady, her expression calm in a way that suggested not indifference, but control. And control was something he had always believed belonged to him. Tessa's hand tightened again on his arm. Her voice no longer just edged but tense, asking in a low whisper who that was. And for the first time, Garrett did not answer immediately, because saying the name out loud would make it real in a way he was not prepared for. And yet everyone else was beginning to understand it without needing confirmation. Whispers spread through the crowd, soft but unmistakable. "Rebecca. Is that Rebecca? I thought she was gone. I heard she moved away. I heard she never recovered." Rumors colliding with reality in real time, each one breaking apart as they met the truth standing in front of them. Rebecca Hartwell stopped just short of the aisle, not close enough to interrupt the ceremony physically, but close enough to redefine it entirely. The officiant had gone silent, unsure whether to proceed or step back. The music had faded into nothing. Even the wind seemed to still, as if the moment itself refused to move forward without acknowledging her. And then something else shifted, subtle but impossible to miss. The attention that had been focused on her alone began to widen, because she was not alone, too small. Figures stepped forward beside her, children, young, composed, dressed with the same understated precision that mirrored her own, their presence quiet but undeniable. And in that instant the tension sharpened into something far more specific, far more dangerous. Garrett's breath caught. Not from surprise alone, but from recognition. Because there were details you could not erase, not completely. Features that carried through time no matter how much distance you tried to create. The angle of a smile, the way a child tilted their head, the familiar echo of something that belonged to him whether he acknowledged it or not. The realization landed without sound yet echoed louder than the jet that had brought her there. And for the first time since the ceremony began, Garrett's carefully constructed composure slipped in a way that no one could ignore, his shoulders stiffening, his expression tightening, his certainty dissolving into something closer to calculation, because this was no longer a disruption that could be dismissed or explained away. This was a presence that carried meaning, evidence, history, and whatever came next was not going to happen in private conversations or quiet negotiations. It was going to happen here, in front of everyone. Exactly where he had tried to prove that his past no longer mattered. And Rebecca, standing there without raising her voice or making a single demand, had already begun to prove the opposite. Garrett finally stepped forward, not fully, not enough to close the distance, but just enough to signal that he still believed he could regain control of the moment. His voice measured when he spoke, carefully chosen, the same tone he used in meetings when something unexpected threatened the outcome. He said Rebecca's name like it was a question instead of a fact, like acknowledging her might still give him leverage. But the reaction from the crowd told a different story, because now everyone was watching not him, but her, waiting, anticipating, measuring what would happen next, and Rebecca did not rush to answer. She let the silence stretch just long enough to shift the balance completely, her eyes steady on Garrett, not emotional, not confrontational, simply present, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, clear, carrying without effort, the kind of voice that did not need to rise to be heard. She said his name in return, not as a challenge but as recognition, as if she were acknowledging a past that no longer held power over her. The effect was immediate, subtle but undeniable. Garrett's confidence faltered again, just slightly, but enough. Tessa shifted beside him, her composure tightening into something more rigid, more defensive, because she could feel it too, the way the energy of the entire event had moved, how the center of attention had shifted away from the couple standing at the altar to the woman who had not been invited to participate in this moment, yet now defined it entirely. One of the children beside Rebecca took a small step forward, not out of uncertainty, but out of quiet instinct. And in that movement something else changed. The guests leaned in, curiosity sharpening into focus, because details that had been dismissed seconds earlier were now impossible to ignore. The resemblance, the timing, the presence, all aligning into a question no one needed to say out loud. Garrett noticed it too. The way eyes moved between him and the children. The way recognition built silently across faces, and for the first time his response was not immediate, not controlled. It was delayed, uncertain, as if he were calculating outcomes that no longer followed his rules. Rebecca glanced down. Briefly, her expression softening for just a fraction of a second as she acknowledged the children. Then she looked back up, steady again. And that single shift carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it suggested something deeper than confrontation, something rooted in truth rather than reaction. Garrett attempted to speak again, this time more firmly, trying to reclaim the narrative, asking what she was doing here, framing it as an interruption, as something inappropriate. But the words did not land the way he intended, because the crowd no longer saw her as an outsider. They saw her as part of the story he had tried to erase. And that difference changed everything. Rebecca did not respond immediately. She reached into the small leather folder she carried, not dramatically, not rushed, just with quiet intention, and that motion alone was enough to draw every eye toward her hands, toward whatever she was about to reveal, because instinctively, everyone understood that this was not just a visit, not just a symbolic appearance. This was preparation meeting timing. This was something planned with precision. And as the folder opened slightly, revealing the edge of documents within, Garrett's expression shifted again, the confidence he had worn all day giving way to something far more fragile, something that recognized the possibility that whatever came next would not be something he could explain away, not in front of this audience, not in this moment, and not against someone who no longer looked like she needed his permission to be heard. The folder did not open all the way at first, and somehow that made it more powerful. The restraint, the control, the way Rebecca allowed the moment to build rather than forcing it, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the documents as if she already knew what they contained was enough. Garrett's eyes locked onto that small movement, his focus narrowing, calculating, searching for an angle, a response, anything that could regain footing in a situation that was slipping beyond his control. He took another step forward now, more deliberate, his voice firmer, asking again what this was about. But there was a subtle change in his tone, something underneath the confidence that had not been there before, something closer to urgency, because he recognized the structure of this moment even if he did not yet know the details. This was not emotional. This was strategic, and strategy meant preparation. Rebecca finally opened the folder fully, not dramatically, not with a flourish. Just enough for the top sheet to catch the light. White paper against the green of the garden, clean, official, unmistakable, and though the guests could not yet read the contents, they felt the shift immediately, because paper in a setting like this did not belong unless it carried weight, and weight meant consequence. Rebecca's voice came again, steady, measured, explaining nothing at first, only acknowledging that some stories sound complete until you look at what was left out, and that single line moved through the crowd like a quiet current, people straightening in their seats, leaning slightly closer, because now this was not just a personal moment. It was a revelation in progress. Garrett's jaw tightened, the words landing in a way he could not easily deflect, because he understood exactly what she meant, not in specifics yet, but in implication, in the suggestion that what had been presented as final was in fact incomplete. And incomplete stories have a way of unraveling when the missing pieces appear. Rebecca lifted the top page slightly, just enough to reveal a header, financial records, dated, structured, precise, her eyes never leaving Garrett's as she held it there, not to display it fully, but to make its presence undeniable. And in that instant the reaction was no longer contained to whispers. There was a visible shift in posture across the guests, a collective recognition that whatever was happening had moved beyond emotion into something verifiable, something documented, something that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding or memory. Garrett spoke again, quicker this time, trying to frame it, to contain it, saying this was not the place, not the time, but the words lacked authority now, because the place had already been chosen, the time had already arrived, and the audience had already shifted. Rebecca lowered the page slightly, her tone unchanged as she responded, not with accusation, but with clarity, stating that timing matters when truth has been delayed, and that some truths are only heard when they are spoken where they cannot be ignored. The children beside her remained still, composed, their presence no longer a question but a confirmation of something deeper, something tied not just to the documents, but to the life Garrett had attempted to. Separate from his present, Tessa stepped forward now, her voice sharper, attempting to interrupt, to redirect, to reframe the moment as inappropriate. But even that effort felt strained, because the attention no longer followed her. It returned to Rebecca, to the folder, to the quiet certainty that had taken control of the space without raising its volume. And as the breeze shifted lightly through the garden, lifting the edge of the paper just enough to reveal more lines, more numbers, more structure, Garrett's expression changed in a way that could not be hidden anymore. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The kind that comes when you understand that whatever comes next will not be undone with a statement or a denial, because it has already been built to stand on its own. The paper did not need to be read aloud to be understood, not completely, because the way Garrett reacted said more than any line printed across it ever could. His posture shifted, subtle at first, but enough to betray the calculation behind his eyes, the quick scanning of possibilities, of exits, of explanations that might still contain what was slipping away. He stepped closer now, lowering his voice as if proximity could reduce the impact, as if keeping the conversation quiet might somehow keep the truth from expanding beyond them. But the audience was already too engaged, too aware, every movement amplified by the silence that surrounded it. Rebecca did not move back. She did not yield space. She simply held her ground with the same calm certainty that had carried her this far. And when she spoke again, it was not louder, but it was clearer, sharper, each word placed with intention. She explained that numbers do not forget, that records do not adjust themselves to match a story, and that what had been presented in court 18 months ago had not been complete, not even close. The statement landed with weight, not as an accusation but as a correction, a realignment of facts that had been hidden long enough to appear final. Garrett shook his head quickly, almost reflexively, attempting to dismiss it before it could take shape, saying there must be some misunderstanding, that financial matters are complex, that documents can be misinterpreted. But even as he spoke, the confidence behind those words weakened, because complexity requires explanation, and explanation requires time, and time was exactly what he did not have in this moment. Rebecca lifted another page, just enough for the structured lines beneath to catch the light again. Columns of figures, dates, transfers, patterns that suggested intention rather than error, and she did not need to describe each entry for the implication to settle in, because the consistency spoke for itself, the repetition, the alignment, the deliberate nature of it all. The guests could feel it. Even if they could not fully understand it, they recognized the shape of something that did not belong in a clean narrative, something that suggested omission rather than oversight. Tessa's composure began to fracture more visibly now, her gaze shifting between Garrett and the documents, searching for reassurance that was no longer immediate, her earlier certainty replaced with something far less stable, because the foundation she stood on was beginning to feel less secure. Garrett's voice rose slightly this time, not in anger, but in urgency, insisting again that this was not appropriate, that private matters should remain private. But the words rang hollow in a setting that had already transformed into something public, something shared, something that no longer belonged to him alone. Rebecca lowered the pages slowly, her expression unchanged, her tone still measured as she responded that some matters stop being private the moment they affect more than one life. And in that sentence, she did not just refer to herself, she acknowledged the children beside her without looking down, their presence steady, undeniable, a living extension of the truth she was revealing. Garrett's breath tightened, his control narrowing further as realization settled in layers, not just about the documents, but about the timing, the setting, the precision of it all. This was not reaction. This was design, every step placed carefully to arrive exactly here, exactly now. And as the last edge of denial slipped from his expression, replaced by something far more exposed, the balance of the moment shifted completely. Because for the first time, it was no longer about whether the truth would surface, it was about how much of it would be revealed before. There was nothing left to protect. Garrett's composure finally broke, not in a dramatic collapse, but in something quieter, more revealing, a hesitation that stretched too long, a silence where certainty should have been, and in that space the truth began to take shape in the minds of everyone watching. Because people do not need full explanations when the pattern becomes clear, they recognize it in fragments, in reactions, in what is not denied quickly enough. Rebecca did not press forward aggressively. She did not raise her voice or step closer. Instead, she allowed the moment to unfold, understanding that the weight of it would do more than any confrontation ever could. She turned one page slowly, deliberately, revealing another layer beneath the first, and this time she spoke with slightly more detail, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to anchor what people were already beginning to suspect. She mentioned undisclosed accounts, transfers that aligned too perfectly with the timing of the separation, assets that had shifted just before legal filings were finalized. Her tone remained even, almost clinical, as if she were describing something that no longer belonged to her emotionally, only factually. And that distance made it more powerful, because it removed any doubt that this was driven by anger or revenge. This was correction. Garrett's lips parted as if to interrupt, but no words came immediately, and that delay echoed louder than any denial could have. Tessa stepped back half a pace without realizing it, her earlier confidence replaced with a visible uncertainty, her eyes moving quickly across the faces in the crowd, searching for support that was no longer there. Because the audience had already shifted completely, they were no longer witnesses to a wedding, they were witnesses to a revelation, and that difference changed how every gesture was interpreted. Rebecca lowered the documents slightly and gestured gently toward the children beside her, not as a dramatic reveal, not as a shock, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something that had always been true. Her voice softened for just a moment as she stated that some consequences are not written on paper. They live, they grow, they become part of the future whether acknowledged or not. And in that sentence the focus shifted again, not just to the documents, but to the children themselves, their presence no longer just symbolic but undeniable. Garrett's expression tightened further, the realization deepening as layers connected, the timing of their appearance, the structure of what Rebecca was presenting, the precision of it all. This was not just about past omissions, it was about present accountability. And for the first time he looked not at the papers, not at Rebecca, but at the children, and something in that glance revealed more than he intended, a recognition that could not be explained away, a connection that did not require confirmation. The crowd felt it immediately, the quiet understanding passing between them without a single word spoken. Rebecca closed the folder then, not abruptly, but with finality, as if everything that needed to be introduced had already been placed into the open. Her posture remained steady, her expression unchanged, but the control of the moment was now absolute. She was no longer presenting evidence. She had already done that. Now she was allowing the reality of it to settle, to expand, to take hold in a way that could not be reversed. Garrett's voice returned finally, lower now, stripped of its earlier authority, attempting to reclaim something, anything. But even as he spoke, It was clear that the structure he had built around his narrative had already begun to collapse under its own weight, because truth, once seen clearly, does not retreat back into silence. And in this moment, in front of everyone he had tried to convince, Garrett was no longer controlling the story, he was part of it. No one clapped, no one spoke, and somehow that silence carried more weight than any reaction ever could, because what had just unfolded did not feel like a spectacle. It felt like a shift, something permanent settling into place. Garrett stood there for a moment longer than necessary, his posture no longer commanding but uncertain, as if he were still trying to locate the version of himself that had controlled every outcome until now. But that version was gone, dissolved somewhere between the first page Rebecca revealed and the moment he looked at the children and recognized what he could no longer deny. Tessa's hand slowly slipped from his arm, not dramatically, not with confrontation, but with a quiet withdrawal that said more than words. Her gaze no longer fixed on Rebecca but on Garrett, searching for clarity that was not coming. Because clarity had already arrived, and it was not in his favor, the officiant lowered his notes, unsure whether the ceremony could continue, and the musicians remained still, their instruments silent, as if the entire event understood that what had been planned no longer fit the reality now standing in front of them. Rebecca did not wait for permission. She did not look for validation from the crowd or acknowledgement from Garrett. She simply stepped back half a pace, her movement small but decisive, signaling that she had said everything she needed to say without ever raising her voice. The children remained beside her, calm, steady, their presence now fully understood, not as a surprise but as a truth that had finally been placed where it could not be ignored. Garrett tried to speak again. One last attempt to reclaim something, to reshape what had already shifted beyond his control, but the words did not come together the way they used to. They lacked structure, lacked certainty, because they were no longer supported by the story he had built, and everyone could hear it, not in what he said, but in what he could not say clearly anymore. Rebecca turned slightly, not toward the exit, not yet, but enough to show that she was no longer anchored to this moment, that she had already moved past it internally, and that was the final shift, the realization that this was never about returning to claim something from him. It was about placing the truth where it belonged, and then leaving it behind. The breeze moved again through the garden, softer this time, lifting the edges of dresses and rustling the rows of white flowers that had been arranged so carefully for a ceremony that no longer felt complete. And in that quiet motion, the contrast became clear. Everything Garrett had constructed was still physically there, the setting, the guests, the ceremony, but its meaning had changed entirely. Rebecca glanced once more at the children, a small, almost invisible acknowledgement, and then she stepped away, not hurried, not dramatic, just steady, the same way she had entered, leaving behind a space that no one could fill with explanations or excuses. Garrett remained where he was, surrounded by everything he had chosen, yet separated from it in a way he had not anticipated, because the one thing he had tried to control completely had been the one thing he never truly owned, the truth, and now it stood in front of everyone, simple, undeniable, and no longer his to reshape. As Rebecca walked toward the path that led back beyond the garden, the weight of the moment followed her for a few steps before settling behind, remaining where it needed to remain, and without looking back. She continued forward, leaving the silence to say what no one else could.